Okay, all good.
Women have a very particular experience within the church. They make up at least half of the church on a Sunday morning. Now, if you think about a church service, then actually there's nearly always far more than 50% who are women. So they play a really important role. But when you begin to look at what's going on in the church from Sunday to the next Sunday, and the bit in between, then you start to realise that the rest of the time is mother and toddlers groups, it's food banks, it's debt centres, it's all kinds of things, and predominantly there's vastly more women than men who are accessing those things. And so for those women, church is providing a place of refuge, a place of safety, a place of support, and it's a really positive experience.
Historically, the church has actually been a vehicle of culture change. I think there's real potential for that actually on the area of violence against women and girls. But to really transform culture, we first have to understand it. And I think not always, but often there can be a lack of understanding or awareness within the church on just how prevalent the issue is. So we need to understand, for example, that 97% of women aged 18 to 24 have experienced sexual harassment. We need to understand that there have been over 54,000 stories of girls in our schools and universities posting their experiences of sexual assault since March this year. We need to understand that the already high amount of domestic violence has increased a lot during the pandemic, and women's services are bulging right now. Often it can be viewed as a bit of a niche issue and something that happens over there. But we need to start realising actually this is something that affects women within our churches and within the communities surrounding our churches.
Society has historically viewed women of colour through a sexual eye because of slavery. They find it hard to speak to any type of institution because historically, most of those institutions are racist. They are institutionally racist. The people in them might not be, but the institution is. And because of that, it makes it difficult for them to trust that their voice will be heard, because they've never had a voice. They've been taught never to have a voice.
So domestic abuse is as real inside the church as it is outside of the church. I work for an organisation called Restored, and we work to equip the church to respond to domestic abuse. And we did some research a couple of years ago that showed that the prevalence within the church is 1 in 4 churchgoers, which is exactly the same as outside. And it was really disappointing to find it, but it wasn't really a great surprise to us. But when we asked the questions in our research, one of the other things that we discovered was that only 1 in 7 people felt that their church would know how to respond if a disclosure was made. And so there's this disconnect really between reality and how well trained some of our churches are. And it's not all churches. Some churches are fantastic. We work with some churches who run fantastic survivor support programs, who do everything they can to support survivors in their community, to stand against domestic abuse. But there are some churches who aren't ready to recognise it's a problem at all, and who really don't know what to do, and who sometimes can make mistakes and even inadvertently make life more difficult for survivors.
So when we try and map out how much abuse is there within Christian faith contexts, but also within other faith contexts and beyond, that's actually quite a difficult question to answer. What we do know is that figures are always underreported. The figures we know are only the figures that come to the notice of statutory authorities, and there will always be far more people who've experienced harm and abuse than those figures represent, because there's lots of reasons why people are not able to speak about their experiences. In terms of sexual abuse within the church, there was a report 2015 to 17 in the Church of England that allegations and disclosures had gone up 50%. That's across different forms of abuse as well. But what we can say with real certainty is that abuse happens in faith contexts, across faith contexts and beyond them. And there are always more cases than the figures would tell us about.
Some churches it's easier to speak about domestic violence in than others, and it's because of the conversation that's happening probably from the front. You see, if church is a place that never ever speaks publicly about domestic abuse, if it isn't connected with domestic abuse charities in its local areas, if they don't preach on it, then actually it becomes this taboo subject which makes people think, well, we can't talk about that. And it's very easy on a Sunday to turn up and put on our Sunday best. And that's not just our clothes, that's trying to show off our families at their best and show off our families as if everything's brilliant and we're all getting along brilliantly and, you know, and God loves us and we love God and everything's shiny and fantastic. And that pressure to appear as if everything is good can put an added pressure onto those who are experiencing domestic abuse, because sometimes in some churches it doesn't feel like that's a safe place where you could admit that actually behind the scenes everything is going wrong. But actually I don't think church should be like that at all. Church at its best is a place where actually we can come in all our mess, in all our mistakes, in all our muddles, and be real, be who we really are. And so if we're able to create a culture of honesty and vulnerability where right from the front it's modelled, how much easier it would be for survivors to step up and step forward and let people know that they need support.
When we talk about responding to abuse, one of the things that often happens is when people share their stories, they might be met with the challenge that if they speak out, they could damage the reputation either of the church or of the individual. And one of the things we've got to understand is that when harm and abuse has occurred, the damage has been done. Speaking about it does not create the damage. The person who's experienced the harm is not the person doing the damage, it's the person who perpetrates the harm. The harm is already there. So it's really important that those messages are not ones that we continue to give either on a public level, which I think we see less of now, but more on a private level where somebody comes to tell their story. But I also think it's really important to recognise that in some cases there are very good responses to disclosures of abuse. My most retweeted tweet was, if the church takes responsibility for when it's done harm, people will start to listen to our stories of when we do good. And I think we need both of those things. So we need to take responsibility for the harm, but we also need to start to look at and talk more about where response is good, and then we want to replicate that so that every person who has an experience has the same good, effective response to their disclosure.
For survivors of abuse who have a faith, there can be some real faith-related barriers to disclosing it, to getting safety, to all kinds of things. And it can be really tied up with their understanding of what scriptures say. And so there are some things about being Christian that are real amazing distinctives, Things like forgiveness, placing somebody else before yourself, loving one another, enduring, persevering. There's all these incredible things that are fantastic parts of being Christian, but when they get put into the wrong place, when some of the scriptures that sit underneath those foundational principles are misused or twisted, then you get some real issues for survivors, because it can create this extra layer of chains, frankly, that hold survivors in their abusive situation.
Women of colour experience trauma from the minute they're made to feel different. When the society in which you live, you feel, has never really allowed your voice to be heard, you feel gaslighted, you've tried. It's very difficult to discern healthy and unhealthy behaviour. Your norm is generally the latter.
So when we try to understand healthy behaviour and unhealthy behaviour and abusive behaviour, one of the things that really helps us to do that is to think of a spectrum of behaviours. So at one end of the spectrum, there's healthy behaviour, good behaviour that's helpful, where people flourish. And what we need to do in our communities is actually to map that more. We need to know what good looks like so we can do more of it. So when we get a good safeguarding, we need to capture that and we need to be able to replicate it. As we go up the spectrum, we get to unhelpful behaviour, and we're all guilty of that at times. We don't respond well to something, or we could have communicated something better. And generally speaking, we might be able to recognise that within ourselves and then address it, and then we might move back down the spectrum to healthy behaviour. If we go up the spectrum further, we might start to see consistent patterns of behaviour, and at that point, that's where they might become unhealthy. So in terms of coercive control in religious contexts, that's where we might see ourselves checking ourselves before we have a conversation with somebody, writing and rewriting an email, or watching how that person's responded to somebody else and being worried and scared about that happening to us. When we see that becoming a pattern of behaviour, we would say that's unhealthy and it needs to be addressed. If it goes further up the spectrum, and if we're talking about spiritual abuse, becomes a consistent pattern of highly controlling, coercive behaviour with a religious rationale, then it can cross that threshold into what we might call spiritual abuse. So when we talk about what is spiritual abuse, it's actually quite a controversial topic in some ways. It's a new terminology that is not as well known as other forms of abuse. When we define it, we talk about it in terms of a systematic pattern of highly controlling, coercive behaviour within a religious context that has a deeply damaging impact on people. So the things that we might see are control, and that might be through censorship, so not being able to speak out. One of the writers in this area says if you say there's a problem, you become the problem. So that pressure to censor yourself. Sometimes it might look like decision making that looks like it's shared, but it's actually made by somebody and everybody else's job is to agree with that. You often might not know that you're in a spiritually abusive relationship or context until you actually break a rule that you might not even know is there. We see often patterns of pressure to commit more and more and more, perhaps more than you are able to give. And often, and this is what's really important, God being used as seen as complicit, so God wants this, or if you're a good Christian, you would do this. And we can see the use of, in the Christian context, the Bible and verses out of the Bible, often taken out of context to pressurise people into behaving in particular ways. So we see sometimes enforced accountability, so being made accountable to somebody without having any choice about the boundaries around that accountability. I think one of the really important things is that this isn't about not teaching, it's not about not having Christian belief and faith, but it's about giving people a choice about how they respond and not equating their response to their relationship with God. I think the other thing that we see really clearly in spiritual abuse is what we call divine position. So the notion that somebody has been appointed by God for this position and therefore they cannot be questioned. We're not questioning whether people are appointed. What we're saying is nobody gets it right all the time, and everybody should be able to be questioned about their behaviours. So the question about whether spiritual abuse, how does spiritual abuse sit within other experiences of abuse is really, really important, because I think it's actually often a hidden part of other forms of abuse if they happen, for example, in this context, within a Christian faith context. So if you experience domestic violence, or you experience sexual abuse, or indeed financial abuse, often spiritual abuse can be an integral part of that, but one that's not necessarily talked about or even recognised. So for example, if you're experiencing domestic violence and there is the use of scripture to get you to stay within that relationship, once you're married for life, or God hates divorce, then that can be part of your experience of those other forms of abuse. So you can experience spiritual abuse on its own, but it can be, and often is, an integral part of other experiences of abuse. One of the things that's really important for us is if we understand that, as communities, we can start to ask ourselves some questions. What do we do that's really healthy, and how do we do more of that? Is there anything within our communities that's unhealthy? And where behaviour crosses a threshold into abuse, what are we doing to address it, and what are we doing to prevent it?
There have been some really dramatic changes through history as to the place and position of women in the church. You know, right from the very, very early church, where we can see that women did have positions of leadership, and then slowly over time it feels like they got faded into the background. But much more recently, we've seen women being able to take positions of leadership across the denominations in all different types of church, but they are different. And it does depend which church you go to as to what that will look like. But there are some examples that have had some outstanding history of recognising the role of women to be able to lead in churches. Salvation Army is a fantastic example. For over 200 years, they've had women in leadership, and it's an extraordinary thing. And we're beginning to see that roll out across the Christian church, certainly in this country. Our basic understanding of the role of women and the equality of women and the place that they have in society and alongside men really matters. It's more than something that I might just disagree with you about, because actually that belief, that is like a foundation. In fact, it's like the roots of a tree. And what sits at the roots and what that grows in will develop the tree that grows out of it. Because those fundamental beliefs that sit at the bottom are what form the behaviours and everything else that comes out of it. So actually it does matter that we get to the bottom of whether or not women are equal, whether or not they're equally gifted, equally capable, equally, able to go out into the world and do the same things as men. Because if we think they're less than, then those behaviours will grow to represent that. Because if we actually create roots that are built and dug into equality, then that's what we begin to see. And we don't tolerate violence against women, and we don't tolerate domestic abuse, and we don't tolerate oppression, because that isn't what we're building everything or growing everything out of. So that theology, those basic understandings and beliefs really, really matter.
So violence against women in all its forms really involves choice being taken away. So choice has to be part of the journey of recovery. For this to happen in a church context, this involves a restoration of the power dynamics. First of all, we need to have women in genuine positions of leadership to readdress the power dynamics at play. And we need to intentionally develop women as leaders so that women have a voice within a church community.
Now, I think some of the really foundational principles are found right at the beginning of the Bible in the book of Genesis, when we read the account of how God created the world, and critically, how God created men and women. So the Bible tells us that God created Adam first, and then he created Eve. And it says that, Eve was created to be his helper. But actually, when you go back to the original language that was written in, we discover that the word that's used is often used to talk about God as well. And so we see that actually Eve has been put in the world to work alongside Adam as his equal, as his partner. And we also see that both men and women are created in God's image. That's what it says. It doesn't say differently, it doesn't say unequally, it doesn't say anything like that. Made in God's image. And when you look at that, that's a beauty of God's original intention for the relationship between men and women, and for the way that they should work together. Neither has superiority, neither has inferiority. They're equals, both made in the image of God, and it's beautiful. And then as we go through the Bible, there are so many different places which talk about the relationship between men and women. But one of those passages that sometimes gets used and weaponized against survivors, and sometimes sits at the root of the inequality and disempowerment that we see, is a verse that we find it in a couple of places, but one of the places it most gets used is in a book called Ephesians. And in that book, there's a letter that's being written to the churches by a guy called Paul. And he's talking about how healthy families should look. And in this one verse that gets taken alone sometimes, it says, "Wives, submit to your husbands." And stood alone, that sounds like men are meant to lord it over their wives. Stood alone, it looks like wives should do whatever their husbands say. But when you step out, you zoom the lens out and you look at the bigger picture, you realise that just a couple of sentences before, Paul's told exactly the same people that actually men and women should submit to one another. Wives and husbands should submit to one another. This is just about loving each other. This is just about preferring one another. It's just about putting each other's needs before your own. But together, there's this togetherness in the whole thing.
And actually, if we look at society, we can see lots of ways in which attitudes around gender, around being women, around being girls has changed and altered. But if we're actually truthful, there's a lot more change that needs to occur. And I think change is probably slower than we think it is. And when we look in our faith communities, and in this context, the Christian faith community, we need to have conversations about how we talk about women and girls. And importantly, we need women and girls to lead on those conversations, because they're the people that have those experiences. In the research that I've done, some people have talked about things like, if I could just learn to be a good girl, and these are grown women, if I could learn to be a good girl, I could be a better part of this faith community. There's something about the constructions we have around women and girls, the attitudes that we hold sometimes, that actually constrain, and that's really important for a number of reasons. Number one, it devalues people. Number two, if you have an experience of abuse, it makes it even more difficult to speak out, because your voice isn't privileged anyway in certain contexts.
When attending church, it might be a diverse congregation or a more white congregation, and women of colour tend to not find their voices. If you feel that you're not appreciated or recognised in any given situation, it's going to be very difficult for you to speak out. In a church environment, that's the last thing that should be happening, but it does happen. And therefore, if people are going through trauma or difficulties, it's very difficult for them to relate that back to their church environment, because they haven't got complete and utter trust in the whole, because they don't think that their voice can be heard or wants to be heard.
So we're not saying the attitude is the same across every context, but we're saying where there are contexts in which women's voices, girls' voices are less valued and less privileged, if they have experiences of abuse, it will be more difficult for them to speak out about those experiences, and it may well be more difficult for them to be heard. So we have a job to do in actually really opening up the conversation. What does it feel like to be a girl, a teenager, a woman in our context? And we've got some challenging to do about the attitudes that there still are in many places towards women and girls, because that for me is part of the answer and the response to abuse.
All women deserve and have the right to an equal voice in all structures. In a church community, it's vital that we see the pain in the people around us. We're there to support them and help them to heal. Because church can be healing. It is a place of healing.
Within our Christian faith communities, we have lots of different theological perspectives that are shared within different contexts. But what's really important is how those messages are shared. How do we share the different positionings that we might have in a way that leaves people feeling respected and valued, but also having a choice in how they respond and how they think about those messages. It's really, really important. If we take the message of unity, if we think about the pandemic, we see Christian communities coming together to look after each other, to make sure that there is contact with older people who might be quite isolated, dropping off food parcels, all of those things. That sense of unity, being in this together, can be really healthy. So we don't want to not do that. But if we use that message differently, we can use it to say, one of the participants in my PhD study said, I was taught to keep my head down and my mouth shut and look on it as a case of keeping unity. That isn't what unity should look like. So it's really important how we teach and the messages that we give, and how we use some of what we call biblical discourses around unity, forgiveness, etc. And one of the things I would say is we need to have some discussions about that, so that people, and we're talking about women and girls, so they're equipped to say, okay, that's the message I've been presented with, but there are different ways of thinking about that message. So I've learnt about unity, but I know it doesn't actually mean to keep quiet if something is happening to me. So we need to open up the conversation about some of these things. And I think some of that is also about thinking about how we're giving out those messages. So who is talking about these messages? So are women, are girls, hearing some of these conversations talked about from women and girls? I think it's really important. Who's giving the message? How is it being given? And how is it being received? And what choice do you have? So we're not saying these messages are in and of themselves damaging. We're saying they can be hugely helpful, but how that message is given is hugely important.
Forgiveness sits at the heart of Christianity. It's one of the most amazing things, because it offers forgiveness to everybody. It offers forgiveness to me, offers forgiveness to you for the mistakes we've made and the things we've done, and it's beautiful, and it's freedom, frankly. But sometimes a misunderstanding of forgiveness or a misteaching of forgiveness can be anything but freedom. It can be the opposite. If we take forgiveness to mean just going back to what it was before, and it being as simple as going, I forgive you, and then everything going back to normal, then actually that means for survivors just going back to abuse. But the truth is that isn't what forgiveness is. Forgiveness is saying, I choose not to hold this against you anymore. It's not saying you can continue to hurt me. It's not saying you can continue to do these bad things that you're doing. It's not saying I'm going to put myself back in danger again. Forgiveness isn't that. That's reconciliation. But that's not even reconciliation. That's just stupid, frankly. But actually, sometimes people find that really hard to get their heads around, because our teaching on forgiveness in the church can be very strong, and giving people a second chance is brought into this idea of forgiveness. You see, if you were friends with an alcoholic, and they had, managed to get themselves off alcohol and they were living sober, the last thing in the world that you would do to help them is to suggest they went and worked in a bar, because that would be a nightmare for them. That would be putting them right back in the heart of all of their, temptation, the thing that they find the most difficult in the world. And I think it's very similar when it comes to abusers, because actually if we forgive too easily, and if we just go back, or if we encourage somebody that we know to just go back, you need to remember what you're doing for the abuser, because abuse is wrong. If we're going to use a really Christian word, abuse is sin. So by putting the victim back into that situation, it's a little bit like putting the alcoholic in a bar, because you're just putting the temptation back in place and saying, here you go, you can keep on doing what you did before. That transformation really does need to happen before anybody ever begins to think about reconciliation. It may very well never be possible. Forgiveness sits separately to that, and it's really important to get our heads around that.
For the Christian who is a survivor of abuse, one of the key messages of hope is that your trauma and what has happened to you does not define you. It doesn't have to define who you are, your identity, your relationships, or your story going forwards. Does that mean that what's happened can be brushed onto the carpet? Absolutely not, and we need to be very clear about that. But what it does mean is that there is a journey of recovery. The whole, throughout the whole drama of Scripture, we see this theme of restoration, that there's a deep restoration in your identity, there's a deeper kind of freedom in who you are, and there's hope for the survivor in that.
I think we have to recognise it's incredibly difficult to tell your story of abuse and harm that you've experienced within church, and survivors are hugely brave when they do that. But I think one of the things that we have seen is that we often don't have a very good response to their stories. Sometimes we do, and we've talked about that, and it's important to capture that. And at the moment we have a landscape where in some situations you might get a very effective response, and in other situations a very ineffective response. We can't have that mixed response. We need a really good response every time. People will risk telling their story once, and the response to that will make them think about whether they ever want to say it again. And so we need to be really clear that an effective response is really important. When you are responded to effectively, that can be hugely helpful and hugely healing.
For some women who've experienced gender-based violence or sexual assault and then disclose that in a church context, they've been disbelieved, or what they've experienced has been minimised. And for some, that experience is actually more traumatising than the abuse itself. So what we see in the Bible is actually that Jesus heard and he trusted women's voices. We see examples of that in the way he interacts with the woman at the well. He reveals for the first time who he is. This real contrast between how the religious leaders of the time engage with women, which is often characterised by disbelief or dismissal or shame or blame, and how Jesus engages with women, which is characterised by grace and kindness and acceptance and stopping for the one.
One of the things about abuse that happens within a church or a Christian context or related context is for people, it can be very difficult for them to separate out what's happened to them. So in a sense, what's being done in God's name from God. And so often what we see is that people's faith and their relationship with God will be impacted by the experience they've had. And that is totally understandable. And it can be very difficult for people post an experience of abuse and harm within a church or indeed any faith organisation to maintain a faith. Sometimes we see people who have a personal faith, but they're not part of an institutionalised religion, so they may not go back to church. But for many people, they may lose their faith in the process as well because of the experiences that they've had.
You see, one of the things about domestic abuse is that it isolates the victim, it isolates the survivor. Slowly but surely they're cut off from friends and family. Slowly but surely they're told that nobody else really cares. Slowly but surely they become more and more isolated in a world of abuse. And what will heal that better than anything is community, and that's what church provides. That's what church can do best. You know, we need to refer to the experts when it comes to rehousing, when it comes to legal things, when it comes to all manner of things. But none of those things will actually provide the community that will restore a survivor to this sense of being part of something bigger and being loved and being part of a community.
I've seen broken people come to church and start the road to healing with the support of the community around them.
I have seen women who have experienced sexual assault or different forms of gender-based violence come into a church setting and begin a journey of recovery. And I have seen those same women come alongside other women within the church on their own journey to recovery. And I'm believing for more of that.
And I experienced that nearly 20 years ago when I left my first husband because of domestic abuse. And actually I'd flown from one continent to the other, and I came back to this country and I lived with my parents for a year, but I went back to my old church, and theologically they weren't entirely sure what to do with me, but they did know how to love me, and they did know how to love the two little girls that I'd brought home with me too. And they were phenomenal. They helped me to decorate my house, as I had a house, and they helped me to repaint. One guy came and helped me sand the floors. There was an old lady who actually every month out of her housekeeping money bought me a little present. One month it was a salt and pepper shaker. Another month it was a set of mixing bowls. And another month it was a rug for my front room. And all these little things, slowly but surely, helped me to believe that I did matter, that my life did have value, that I belonged to a community of people who loved me and who had me and who would help me with my children. They'd babysit, they'd make sure I could get to work, they'd do all these things. And what they did was absolutely invaluable. But I think it's something that more churches can do. Like, that's what we're good at. We're good at being family. We're meant to be family. And we can be family for survivors of domestic abuse in every city and every town and every street.
In terms of opportunities for change and what we see around change, I think there are some messages that are encouraging. If we look back over 10 years, we see there is a huge amount of work that has been done around safeguarding. We see much more training around many more issues. We see advances in policy and practice. What we need to make sure is that policy makes its way into practice on the ground. But we have seen a lot of change. We did a survey last year with safeguarding leads in Christian faith context, and there were some really positive messages that came out of that. Some of the safeguarding leads were saying that compared with previous years, people were starting to understand safeguarding more. They were starting to see it and part and parcel of church ministry.
You know, we put together fantastic training to equip churches to know how to respond to support survivors of domestic abuse. And we know that when people take that training, it changes the story for survivors in their church and in their community.
I've been involved in training across lots of different denominations where people are really getting to grips with how do we respond well to harm where it's occurred, but how do we create cultures and communities in which people are healthier and safer and in which harm is less likely to occur and more likely to be identified quickly if it does occur. So I think there is a lot of evidence for change.
We need to engage in prevention work, working alongside families and parents, kids workers and youth workers. And we need to teach into these issues to begin to change the context in which violence against women and girls happens.
We see work being done at the moment around the theology of safeguarding. The Methodist Conference in 2021 supported a theology of safeguarding that includes spiritual abuse. So there's a lot of work being done at the moment. That isn't to minimise the harm that people have experienced. There's a lot more work to do. We know from the independent inquiry that there is a lot of work to do, but there is a lot of work ongoing, and what we need to do is galvanise that work and to see it as more and more integral to the work of the church so that we can create these healthier, safer communities for the future. We always want to see change happen quicker than it is, and also every time somebody is harmed and abused, it matters. It matters, it affects lives, and it needs to be addressed quickly because the people who have these experiences are valuable and it matters and they should be responded to well. And we should be doing everything we can to prevent harms. I have this sort of dream that I will be 90 years old in a rocking chair, hopefully with some grandchildren, maybe some great-grandchildren, no pressure on my kids. And I will look back and think, look how far things have come. We started this conversation when actually there was lots of harm being shown everywhere, lots of cases coming to light, lots of inappropriate responses, and we're now in a position where actually the church and the Christian community has learnt to prevent and to respond, and most importantly they've learnt that that isn't an add-on to what the church should be doing, it is what the church should be doing.
There's a story in the Bible that drives me to keep on going. And it's a story that doesn't get told very often. It's a story from a book right back towards the beginning of God's people's history. It's a story of horrific violence against women. It's a story of a woman whose name we never even get to hear. We just know her by relationship to her priestly husband. And in this story, we watch her lose her agency from beginning to end as slowly but surely everything gets stripped away from her. And it's a story of a woman whose husband prioritizes himself over her at every single turn. To save his own life, he pushes this woman out of a door and closes it behind her and leaves her with a bunch of men who are out to get one thing. And then we read that this woman gets abused all night long until in the morning she is left for dead. When the husband finds his wife, he actually does something really quite grotesque. He chops up her body and he sends pieces of it out to the 12 tribes of Israel. And it's what happens then that motivates me, because as the men of Israel gather together in horror at what has happened, they say this. They say, just imagine that such a thing could happen in Israel. That they're horrified that something like this could have happened in God's kingdom. How could this happen? The truth is, it probably just reflected a lot of other things that were going all around. But this one incident suddenly lit a fire underneath them, and it lit a passion within them. And they said, we must do something, so speak up. And that's a Bible verse that I wish everyone got taught. I wish it's a story that I understand why we don't speak about it very often, because it's not one that you can even talk about in front of children. But that call of God's people at the end matters so much, because it's the call of God's people to say, just imagine, violence against women is horrific. It shouldn't have a place in God's kingdom. It needs to come to an end. And as God's people, our response is to do something and to speak up. And that challenge, that command, that call really is what motivates me and propels me to keep on going, even on the days when it's difficult, even on the days when I'm devastated by the stories that I hear, because I want to continue to do something and I want to speak up and I want to call the church to do that with me.